Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. Patrick from Atlanta, Georgia writes, Daniel, I just listened to episodes 37 and 38 of your podcast on the Spanish Civil War. I too have read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and I thought you did a great job of summarizing the book and Orwell's frustration with war. I'm off to buy Peter Kemp's book as well. Keep it up. Thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick actually donated some money, which is a great idea. You should too. expatmadrid.com/donate. You can donate $10, you can donate $50, you can donate $100, whatever floats your boat, I'm there, and I appreciate all of it. Today, you're in luck because I've got another historical episode. I've spent the last several weeks listening to the Revolutions podcast, more specifically, season 10 of the Revolutions podcast, which is all about the Russian Revolution, and took the author Mike Duncan more than 3 years to make. I started at the end. The Revolutions podcast goes through several other revolutionary moments in history before getting around to the Russians. The Mexican Revolution, the American War of Independence, the French in 1789 and 1830, etc. But I was more interested in Russia, so I skipped all that and went straight to the good part. Let me tell you, I was not disappointed. The season about the Russian Revolution starts with Marx and Engels in the 1840s, ends with Stalin's absolute power in the 1930s, and has a lot to say about all things Russian and Soviet in between. Finally, after 103 episodes, I'm done. And although the whole thing was very good, one bit that made my ears perk up was the final episode about Stalin's Great Purge. The Great Purge took place from 1936 to 1938, and hey now, weren't those basically the same years that the Spanish Civil War was going on? Why yes, the Spanish Civil War started in 1936 and ended in 1939, with Franco's troops marching into Madrid and Barcelona. Famously, Stalin and the Soviet Union were the only ones willing to support the Spanish Republic during the Civil War. Hitler and Mussolini supported the national side, and the other powers, the UK, France, the US, etc., not wanting to support either side, just stayed out. So, what does the Russian Revolution have to do with Spain? Well, one of Stalin's main objectives in the purge was to get rid of Trotskyism, Trotsky himself being in exile in Norway and then Mexico by that point. I thought, while listening naturally, of George Orwell, who was forced to flee Spain after a brief stint fighting in the war. Forced to flee, in fact, when his party was made illegal by the Stalinists. I talk about this in episode 37 quite a bit, Homage to Catalonia. It's a very interesting story. So, the Revolutions podcast gave me some valuable context on the Stalinist purge and Trotsky situation. Orwell mentions in the book that the outcome of the Spanish Civil War was decided more in other countries than it was in Spain. This is probably part of what he meant. The Stalinist purge in the Soviet Union was brought to Spain by the Soviets who were helping out with the war effort, and it became a whole thing. That's one of the big lessons that I got from rereading Homage to Catalonia this year. The famous leftist infighting that most people claim lost the Spanish Civil War sounded, in Orwell's version, much more like a Stalinist purge. And it was. It was part of the Great Purge. You can check Wikipedia for more about the Great Purge. Most of the information here in this podcast is from the Revolutions podcast, which you can find on Spotify, etc. I also Googled around to confirm some bits, and there are links on the blog expatmadrid.com if you want more. Anyway, Orwell talks at length about his party, the PUM, the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista. I think that stands for the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification is what they're calling it in English. Anyway, this party was accused of Trotskyism and abolished after a few months of civil war. That is what leads Orwell to flee Spain. He takes the train up to France and then back to England, kind of just leaving the hotel as quickly as possible. After the Barcelona May Days of 1937, the May Days are described in the final chapters of his book, Homage to Catalunya. As a modern reader, 85 years after all this happened, I wasn't clear on much of the details when Orwell was talking about it, but presumably all of this Stalin versus Trotsky stuff would have been big news at the time, and a well-informed person in the 1930s would have known more. Up until recently, I knew almost nothing about the battle between the Russian parties for the soul of the worldwide communist revolution, or whatever kind of revolution. There were lots of different parties trying for lots of different kinds of revolution, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because I learned a lot more from the Revolutions podcast. Most of it has nothing to do with Spain, but since I am interested in the conflict between socialist and capitalist ideologies, and since it is my podcast, I've decided to take a moment today to talk about those crazy Russians. So let's get to it with a few things I learned from the Revolutions podcast. First, the Tsar was a very incompetent totalitarian. Back in high school, instead of teaching us about the Bolsheviks and the revolution of 1917, my world history teacher spent a week or so showing us the movie Nicholas and Alexandra. I don't remember much. The little hemophiliac Tsarevich and his relationship with Rasputin, the huge mansions, and the general tone of the film, which I believe suggested that it was sort of a pity that all those nicely dressed aristocrats were harassed and then shot by a bunch of dirty revolutionaries. Fair enough for Tsar Nicholas II. If you don't look like a good guy in your own high-budget biopic, where are you going to look good? On the other hand, I was not the type of teenager who was going to sit around sympathizing with royalty. Young, rebellious, and suffering from a total lack of information, I watched the movie and decided that the communists were probably the good guys in the whole Russian Revolution story. I later found out otherwise. In hindsight, that teacher could have saved us all a lot of time by actually teaching something, rather than just putting on the movie and calling it a day. But who am I to judge? In any case, I was surprised through about 20 episodes of Revolutions by just how bad the Tsar was at his job of czaring, as well as how awful the whole regime was for decades or more before anyone was able to do anything to change it. Not that they didn't try. People in Tsarist Russia were put into prison or forced to go into exile for owning banned books or doing anything to speak out about how shitty the situation was. There was no protest or freedom of speech or freedom of association, and also no elections. It wasn't like, for example, people in the West these days being convinced that they live in a fascist dystopia because their party didn't win this time. But it's okay because in 4 years they can vote again and protest all over social media 24/7 in the meantime. No, Nicholas became Tsar in 1896 and could plausibly have held on to absolute power for several decades. For the early 20th century Russians, it was revolution or nothing. Meanwhile, most of the old revolutionaries had to meet up in secret, writing articles, planning campaigns to overthrow the system, smuggling books, trying to spot police infiltrators in their groups, and they often spent years in exile around Europe, where they could work in relative peace. Meanwhile, the Tsar absolutely sucked as a ruler, and eventually, during World War I, gave quite a bit of power to his wife, Alexandra, who amazingly sucked even more. Not only were the two of them embarrassingly bad rulers, they were also strongly religious, and believed that the absolute power of the Tsar and the Romanov dynasty was ordained by God himself. To suggest otherwise meant you were working for Satan. Literally, working for Satan. So any sort of liberal reform was out of the question. The Romanovs lived in a bubble, surrounded by incompetent yes-men, and Nicholas seems to have had the world's largest sense of entitlement. Not that you can blame him personally. I'm sure that growing up as 19th century royalty and being in charge of a massive empire will do that to a guy. World War I, of course, is a very long story, and I'm not going to go into it here. Suffice it to say that the war is what eventually brought Nicholas down. It brought down a lot of Europe's monarchies, in fact. Nicholas II held on to his position for as long as he could, but finally, after many disasters and blunders, he stepped down when the generals in his army got together and wrote him letters, saying that absolutely nobody wanted him running the country anymore. All this in the context of a very bloody world war, as I mentioned, and also the February Revolution of 1917. Lenin was still in exile, and the Bolsheviks were an irrelevant fringe party when the Tsar resigned. So Nicholas and his family were put on house arrest, or more accurately, palace arrest, by the provisional government. Lenin showed up back in Russia a bit later, sponsored by the Germans, and somehow took over the whole government in the October Revolution. Soon after that, adios, Tsar Nicholas. It's a bit of a long story, but eventually Nicholas, Alexandra, and the rest were shot in a basement by those aforementioned dirty revolutionaries. Although it bears mentioning that Duncan proposes in one of his appendix podcasts that if Nicholas had been just slightly less of a moron, he would have allowed for some liberal reforms and maybe a parliament, and everything could have gone much differently. Duncan calls it the great idiot theory of history. Most of the big revolutions could have been avoided if only the person in power at the time had been able to listen to reason and make a few changes. Anyway, speaking of great idiots, let's go back to 15-year-old me back on the ranch in Arizona. Because my sympathy for the communists in 1997 or so came from the black and white idea that if the czarist types were the bad guys, the people fighting against them must have been the good guys. What can I say? I was in high school. I now know that history is often a struggle between bad guys and even worse guys, but in those days I was younger and much more innocent. Also, I should mention that there were plenty of parties trying to change things in Russia. Many of them were proposing reasonable parliamentary reform. The Bolsheviks, in particular, were some very bad guys, and unfortunately, they're the ones who ended up taking over after October 1917. But it didn't have to go that way. All of which brings us to our big point here. The Bolsheviks ruined everything almost immediately. So about those Bolsheviks, huh? Back when I was younger, and getting my historical information mostly from Hollywood movies and dreadlocked college freshmen, I'd hear things like, well, unfortunately, real communism has never been attempted, or, if Lenin had survived a few more years, everything would have been fine. I now know that those are pretty awful excuses, and, incidentally, borderline apology for genocide. Communism killed millions, often targeting ethnic minorities, and, in my humble opinion, anyone making excuses for regimes that kill millions is an asshole at the very least. So, in the interest of setting the record straight with my uninformed teenage self, here are a few facts. Fact 1. Lenin was a total psycho. A popular misconception among dreadlocked college freshmen back in the day was that Stalin was the bad guy in the whole Soviet thing, But Lenin was actually pretty cool. Wrong. Lenin was a psycho who started the Red Terror in order to get people on board with the Bolshevik program. It's true. Old Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin, wanted to terrorize the Russian people into accepting Bolshevik rule. The Bolsheviks started the Cheka, their own secret police force, almost immediately after gaining power, and began terrorizing. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the fault of the capitalist powers interfering in Russian affairs. It was an intentional policy, and estimates say that 200,000 people were killed, possibly more. Lenin's hanging order is a telegram in which he famously orders 100 kulaks to be publicly hanged, so that, quote, "For hundreds of versts around, the people see, tremble, no, shout. The blood-sucking kulaks are being strangled and will be strangled." A verst is about a kilometer, and kulaks were the wealthier peasants at the time, although later the word came to mean anyone who owned a cow or any sort of agricultural machinery. Anyway, that strangling of kulaks was part of the terror. Eventually, there was a lot more. Lenin wasn't a cool guy. Neither was Trotsky, and neither, obviously, was Stalin. They were all maniacs. Listen to the podcast for details. Before we continue, I know I'm dating myself with my reference to dreadlocked college freshmen. These days, dreadlocks on white people is politically incorrect, so those types have blue hair and they believe they can change their genders like I change my underwear. Not every day necessarily, but whenever it feels right. I don't know what they think about Lenin, but I assume they're getting their information from other blue-haired kids on TikTok, and are not much better informed than I was in the 90s. Moving on, this next part is important. Fact number 2. Communism just doesn't work. I guess your average blue-haired college freshman or delusional Bernie bro probably doesn't know much about this, but the Soviets tried doing a bunch of things to create a communist utopia, and they all failed miserably. Once again, you can't really blame anyone else for this because they got rid of all the opposition parties and had absolute power in a way that very few political parties have ever had in world history, and they still failed to do anything useful. So, what did they do wrong? Well, for one thing, they tried letting the workers control the factories. Soon, the workers, hungry as they were because World War I was on and because communism doesn't work, were just making things they could sell on the black market or exchange for food. Russian industry was collapsing, and within a few months, the Bolsheviks had to bring back the old managers, now as state employees, to get the factories to produce what was actually needed for the economy. Then there's the situation of the peasants. Russia was a primarily agricultural economy even in 1917, so one of the Bolsheviks' first moves was to expropriate the land owned by big holders and give it to the peasants. So far, so good. But, as communists, they couldn't just let the peasants sell their surplus food at a profit. Instead, they sent out soldiers to requisition the food at gunpoint so they could supply the workers in the cities. So the peasants owned the land, but in the end, they were just being forced to work it by men with guns. The government called it war communism, and it led to mass starvation when peasants just stopped growing surplus grain rather than work all year only to have the fruits of their labor taken from them at gunpoint. The public hangings of kulaks that I mentioned before were part of this policy. It's what happened if people rebelled against the grain requisition system. Eventually, people started realizing that they were even worse off under the Bolsheviks than they had been under the Tsar. Some urban workers rebelled and organized strikes, but the party, now because they had suppressed all dissent, the only party, put down the strikes, saying that since they, the Bolsheviks, represented the workers had no reason to strike. Anyone who disagreed was going to be purged. This also happened within the ranks of the military. The Kronstadt Rebellion is the most prominent example. That rebellion ended when a few thousand people were executed for striking against Bolshevism. To quote Orwell, "All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others." Fact 3. A ton of people starved. Yes, a lot of people starved under communism. Some starved almost immediately, others starved later. I had a basic idea about the Holodomor, aka the Great Ukrainian Famine, before listening to the Revolutions podcast. Little did I know that that was just one of the famines that had Russians dying in droves after the Bolshevik Revolution. Turns out the starvation started right away. Remember those peasants having their grain taken away by the policy of war communism? Well, as it turns out, that whole thing just made Russian agriculture less productive. Much less productive. Soon, millions were starving or being fed by the US government. Yes, you heard right. Under the Russian Famine Relief Act, a US food program fed millions of Russians every day for a few years after World War I. Duncan suggests that Herbert Hoover, in fact, saved the fledgling Soviet government from a crisis that surely would have ended it otherwise. Hoover himself believed, apparently, that the US program would show everyone the superiority of Western capitalism and thus help stop the spread of communism. And he was wrong. Because the US imported grain to feed millions of Russians every day for years, the Soviet regime survived, and today, blue-haired college students are still able to think that communism is just a system with a few minor flaws that need some working out. It's not. It's a system that kills many, many people every time it's seriously attempted. Communism, I repeat, does not work. Why not? Because people make decisions based on incentives, and if you make it illegal or socially unacceptable to produce goods that people want and need, you're just de-incentivizing production and creating poverty and starvation. On the other hand, capitalism, for all its flaws, at least encourages people to be useful. Communists tend to make being useful illegal, and instead create more bureaucracy. Communist regimes usually end up killing or imprisoning a lot of people just for being smart or successful. And guess what? If you get rid of the smart and successful people, all you end up with is more laziness and mediocrity. Everybody just working for the common good sounds like a nice solution, but in practice, if somebody is holding you at gunpoint and taking all your stuff, you might not find it comforting to know that it's all for the common good. This sort of situation with lots of bureaucracy also creates lots of opportunities for corruption. It's all in the Revolutions podcast, or don't take my word for it, just look into the history of the Soviet Union, or Communist China, or Cuba, or Cambodia, or Venezuela, etc. Of course, it's also more complicated than just that, but that's the short version. Will Storr has quite a bit more in the final chapter of his book, The Status Game, which is very interesting throughout. The Status Game by Will Storr, Storr. I recommend that book for its discussion of human nature. Anyway, all this stuff about the failure of the Russian Revolution fits neatly with my personal history sucked hypothesis, in which doing a thing with good intentions can end up leading you to a very, very bad place, because, well, history sucked. I've mentioned this before in other articles and other podcasts, but it bears repeating here. A lot of history totally sucked, and things that seem like good ideas at the time can get way out of hand. All those revolutionaries trying to take down the Tsar? Not a bad idea. He was a total incompetent, his system was corrupt, and there was no other way of getting him out of office. Revolution was the only plausible outcome. And in a more perfect world, Russia could have ended up with a UK-style parliamentary system instead of 70-plus years of communist hell. What about Herbert Hoover, the arch-capitalist just trying to save starving babies as part of the American Relief Administration? Well, he ended up feeding millions of Russians every day, like I said, and preserving the very regime he was so against. And that would lead to even more starvation in the following decades. That's just how it goes. The Russian famine of 1920 to 1923, in which millions died, was followed by the 1932 to 1933 famine in Ukraine, in which millions more died. Plenty of people ended up practicing cannibalism in both instances. Another million people died of starvation in the siege of Leningrad during World War II. If anything, World War II was even deadlier than the revolution as far as the Russians were concerned. All in all, history sucked. Let's hope we never live to see interesting times like that. There was a period in my life when I would have loved to see some truly interesting historical times. That me lived in the Arizona desert and was bored out of his mind by algebra and world history class. He certainly had no idea what was actually involved in those times. I was left by the Revolution's podcast, feeling grateful not to have been around for any of it. Duncan mentions on several occasions that even the best revolution is just work of a handful of committed souls. Most people in most places hate politics and don't want to have anything to do with it. I myself sort of wish politics would go away and leave us all alone. But I guess great purges and massive famines can happen to the politically apathetic just as they do to the actively partisan. These things can spiral out of control, and suddenly, nobody's safe. I'll leave you with that today, and with the big corollary to my history sucked hypothesis, which is that there's absolutely no reason to believe that things can't start sucking again on a very high level. If you had run into Lenin in a cafe in Zurich in 1916, you'd probably have thought, what an insufferable twat. You certainly wouldn't have predicted he'd be running the entire Russian government within a year. Even when he got back to Russia in 1917 with all his German money, people thought he was just another lunatic from an irrelevant fringe party. His wife and his friends thought he had lost it when he got off the train and started planning a coup against the provisional government. All this could have gone much differently, but it didn't. As Morgan Housel says, people are very good at forecasting the future, except for the surprises, which tend to be all that matter. Read Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, or he's got a new book out, Morgan Housel, Housel. Highly recommended. Anyway, people are very good at forecasting the future, except for the surprises, which tend to be all that matter. It's true. If you wrote a novel with a plot anything like the Russian Revolution, it would all seem insanely implausible. But it happened, and not that long ago. History sucked, and we're very lucky, most of us, to be here where we are right now. Anyway, until next time, happy December from beautiful Barcelona. It's a couple weeks before Christmas, and I hope you have a great Christmas out there, wherever you are. If there's a bit of echo in this podcast, I apologize. I'm recording in a new house. I talked about buying a house in my previous episode. I think it's episode 58. Buying a flat in Spain. I just say house, but it's a flat. That's important, I guess. Anyway, I'm recording in my new living room. I don't have anything resembling a studio set up yet, but I'll get around to that once I've got all of the major furniture and appliances taken care of. If you enjoyed this podcast, please donate. Go to expatmadrid.com/donate and send some money. You can send whatever amount you want, a couple of bucks or a couple of $100. I appreciate it all. I want to keep doing this for free for as long as I can. I'm just a guy sitting around reading books, listening to stuff, and drawing some conclusions. I write over at expatmadrid.com if you'd like to read some of my writing. It includes a lot of stuff that doesn't make it to the podcast because, well, not everything is great podcast material, but it could be an interesting article. So expatmadrid.com. You can find me and follow me on Instagram. I'm Daniel Welsh, Welsch. If you have any questions or comments, hit me up through the blog or donate some money and send me a private message while doing so. I read all of those, and I will most likely get back to you. If you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, I wouldn't mind interviewing a few people who are interesting and have something to say that is related to Spain, the Spanish language, etc. Let me know. I will consider doing some more interviews in the near future. And nothing else for today. I hope you have a great day. I probably pissed off some people with this episode, but it was worth it. Nada más por hoy. Hasta la próxima. Bye.